Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you to all of you again for really um, working hard to stay on top of your journals, on top of your readings, and in communication with me over email. I really appreciate all the effort you put into this really sort of incredibly strange series of events, sort of tragic series of events as a result of the COVID-19 spread. So thank you to all of you who have so generously and quickly picked up and moved things online, and we're still able to complete the assignments and maybe watch synchronously or asynchronously some of these Zoom presentations. Again, thank you for being so agreeable and so sort of supportive of the things that we've been doing. I really appreciate it. This is going to be my last presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me through email as well. I will be available anytime until next Wednesday to talk to you about, I hope you're working on your cultural analysis drafts. Again, this paper is just really a reflection on a cultural object that accompanies a character from one of the myths that we've been reading. I hope that you don't find this too stressful in terms of time, in terms of resources. I know both are really difficult at this moment, finding time, maybe sharing a computer. Also doing research remotely, something we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but I'm trying to help you along with. If you do get a chance though, please by this evening, submit to me some sort of draft, some sort of thought about your final paper. Again, this, when I say final paper, just meaning the last paper of our class, not necessarily that it's the most important paper. But cultural analysis draft here, and then as soon as you submit it, I'm going to work my hardest to get you some feedback as quickly as possible so that you can finish up your work. I do not have a final exam for you. I don't think that it's something I'm equipped and feel sort of capable of sort of requiring of you at this moment. So I have updated your grades to reflect the different weights for the assignments. So for example, a preparedness grade, essay grade, journal grade, all of those should be in. If you'd like an opportunity to complete the journal, the last journal, which covers our optional, it's sort of an optional journal on our final chapter 30, Isis and Osiris, that's fine as well. I'd look forward to reading those. So thank you again. You've been a really great class. I'm just so sad that we couldn't sort of finish up in person. And I hope that things are going well on your end. I know that there are lots of complications. One of the things I wanted to do very briefly is to just outline some of the highlights from Isis and Osiris. So one of the things we looked at in this chapter were a selection of different texts that add up to basically a consortium of ideas about Isis, this female goddess in Egyptian culture, and sort of how she transforms through the different texts in different times. So we begin with some sort of pyramid texts and coffin texts, literally texts that are written on pyramids or inside of coffins. And later by Plutarch, who is a Greek who is coming much later, but writes and sort of incorporates Isis and Osiris in a work called On Isis and Osiris. And then finally, we get a selection from, actually written in novel form, from this man named Roman Apuleius, who lives much later, 125 to 170 Common Era, and writes a novel called The Golden Ass, and talks about Lucius and his adventures as a donkey. So just a few quick notes. I asked you in the final journal as extra credit if you could just kind of explore Isis, her cult, and how she undergoes syncretism, which is basically this mixing of different elements or different traditions, basically carrying Isis over into different religious traditions based on sort of where she is in this timeline. And so how does she sort of change or transform across these cultures? During the Roman Empire, about 27 to 300 Common Era, Isis became well established in the Greek centers of Eleusis and Delphi, so she actually becomes subsumed in the Greek and Roman culture, which were formerly strongholds of the gods Demeter and Apollo. And we didn't get to talk too much about Demeter or Apollo, but there's actually a whole chapter dedicated to Demeter called abstract, a selection from something called the Hymn to Demeter on page 530. You can look at that if you want. Her worship grew in northern Greece and Athens. And in the spread of her cult, the identity of Isis underwent this thing called syncretism, which again is the mixing of elements from different religious traditions. and her role broadens and becomes more universalized. She became queen of heaven, the mother goddess, the healer and sorceress. She was worshipped by more and more different sort of demographics, so men and women, free people and slaves. And all of her followers found something special for themselves in her message. So she becomes very much universalized here. Her worship became a mystery religion like that of Demeter, and she had initiates and priests of her own. So she really grows in popularity. And I thought that was something exciting to see across these texts here. In the coffin text, for example, what's called the Passion of Osiris, Isis gives him new life. So in the traditional sense, Isis is related to Osiris. With her sister Nephthys, she ministers to the unconscious god Osiris and gets him to rise on one side. The flood waters were believed to pour from the thigh of Osiris to revitalize the land. And so Osiris is also very closely tied to the health and the well-being of the land, the sort of flow of water along the Nile. Remember, the Nile is the river that connects all of these really important Egyptian cities, both from the early dynastic period all the way to the Greco-Roman period. We see it to the far north, Alexandria on page 541, and then all the way to the south, Thebes and Edfu. But later, when Plutarch, the Greek, sort of transforms or incorporates or syncretizes Isis into his text called On Isis and Osiris, something that's really interesting. Oh, just a quick note, this image here, I have the coffin text. This is a gold gilded middle coffin from Tutankhamun. And so her image you'll often see on coffins because she becomes the one that mourns for Osiris's dead body, and she revives him so that he's no more. So he becomes enlivened again. And so her image is often found on the feet of coffins. These burial coffins. But here's Plutarch. Here's another image of Osiris. And what's interesting about here is she is, this is a bust of Isis from Roman artwork. So this is much later. And so it's Isis / Demeter, and we can see some of that iconography here too. Demeter is the goddess of grain, agriculture, and so Isis, it makes sense that someone who revives Osiris, kind of who makes the land fertile and rejuvenates it through his outpouring of water, is also subsumed in the meaning of Isis. One thing that's really interesting here is she, in the Plutarch's On Isis and Osiris on page 5, top of 548, is that she has this moment where she is conflated with Demeter. I'm sorry, it's the top of 550. And so what happens with her is she becomes responsible in this text for nursing a child, for taking care of this child at the very top of page 550. And it says, Isis nursed the child by putting her finger into his mouth instead of the breast. And in the night, she would burn away the mortal portions of its body. She herself would turn into a swallow and flit about the pillar with a wailing lament until the queen, who had been watching when she saw her babe on fire, gave forth a loud cry and thus deprived it of immortality. And so Isis, these gods are often responsible for taking children and trying to turn them into gods, deifying them. And so where we see this originally, Plutarch is sort of conflating her with Demeter on page 530. Demeter does something similar. As if he were the child of a god, Demeter anointed him with ambrosia, holding him to her bosom and breathing on him sweetly. At night, she hid him like a firebrand in the blazing fire, secretly from his dear parents. And so we have this instant where these goddesses, Isis and Demeter, are being conflated in terms of their ability to make a child immortal, or their attempts at least to make him or her immortal. Our last text here was interesting. A very interesting selection, because we don't get too much in terms of what happens to the golden ass or what happens with Isis, but we get this really kind of beautiful image of what our textbook calls Pleiaphasia, a springtime blessing of the ships, which eventually becomes conflated with this event we call Carnival. But basically, Lucius, who is the protagonist, accidentally turned into an ass by dabbling in magic, and only by eating roses can he return to his human form. But since the flowers are scarce, we find at the end of the novel, he sees a vision of Isis who calls upon him to become her follower. And the next day, Lucius regains his human form upon seeing a procession of Isis, and sort of happens to munch on a garland of roses. And so she grants him specific powers to transform back into a human. And here is a 16th century fresco. So we're thinking about the 1500s here, much, much, much later, by an unknown artist, depicting a scene of here's Lucius, and he's having a vision of Isis calling upon him to become his follower. And so even later on do we see this really interesting syncretism of Isis. She really transforms. She's really sort of ingrained, no pun intended, with these later religions and later cultures. And so I think it's kind of brilliant that the textbook pitted all of these different texts together. I would have liked to see a little bit more of the sort of primary Egyptian texts. We have the Shabaka stone that sort of talks about that stone, which bears an ancient inscription on page 547. A little bit about the very, very short amount of writing from the pyramid texts and coffin texts, and a lot from sort of much later texts. But apparently there doesn't seem to be too much that we have left about Isis. In fact, our textbook says on page 546 that we are indebted to Plutarch for this story of Isis and her adventures with Osiris, because it's no other complete account of the story of Isis, and none from an Egyptian source exists. So apparently some of these things, some of these mythologies are very scarce, and I think it's great that we had at least the opportunity to test out and see Isis through the ages. But I have that final question if you'd like to respond to it in our journal. And then next week, please send me in your final drafts of your cultural analysis paper. But in the meantime, do send me a quick draft. It could be an outline. It could be sort of your sketches of the first few paragraphs, anything you have that I can give you feedback on and direction for in the next few days. So again, thank you. It's been a really wonderful time working with you. And I really appreciated your contributions and your sort of rigor in terms of staying on top of these things, even though this class wasn't meant to be an online class. You've done beautifully sort of getting yourselves online and responding to me electronically, and I really appreciate that attention and care from each of you. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for your efforts and your contributions. I've learned a lot, and I hope that this has been a valuable experience for you amid pandemic. So thank you again, and have a wonderful night.